By the time the 1990s rolled around, the floppy disk had secured its place as an essential part of everyday digital life. It was practically everywhere. Whether you were a student typing up your first science report, a teenager trading pirated copies of Wolfenstein 3D in a school hallway, or a parent installing Print Shop Deluxe to make greeting cards on a clunky home computer, odds were good that a small square disk was part of the process. That unassuming plastic square, with its distinctive click and mechanical feel, was none other than the 3.5-inch floppy disk, a modest-looking device that quietly powered a generation's interaction with early personal computing. The 3.5-inch floppy was the compact, tougher, and more refined successor to the older 5.25-inch diskettes that had ruled the 1980s. Those earlier floppies were as delicate as they were ubiquitous. Flimsy, flexible, and all too easy to damage. They could warp under sunlight, attract dust like magnets, and buckle if you so much as sat on them by accident. The 3.5-inch version, by contrast, was a revelation. With its hard plastic shell, spring-loaded metal shutter to guard the magnetic disc inside, and a slimmer, more portable shape, it felt like the future. It didn't just look tougher, it was tougher, and it fit neatly into backpacks, desk drawers, and shirt pockets alike. By the early 1990s, the bulkier 5.25-inch drives were rapidly disappearing from desktops and computer labs, and the 3.5-inch floppy had taken over completely. It became the default, the standard, the workhorse of digital file storage. This newer floppy didn't just win in terms of durability, it also delivered more in terms of storage, at least by the standards of the time. The high-density version of the 3.5-inch disk could hold a mighty 1.44 megabytes of data, while the lower-density version held 720 kilobytes. In an era before high-resolution images, bloated software suites, and streaming media, that was more than enough for a few essays, some spreadsheet files, and maybe a tiny game or two. For many people, this was their first real taste of portable digital storage, something you could hold in your hand, label with a marker, and carry from one machine to another. Floppy disks weren't just about storage. They were a kind of personal artifact. Each one could be personalized, scrawled with a name, a subject, or a warning like "Do not erase," written in thick pen. Students got into the habit of using color-coded labels to organize their assignments. Some disks were covered in stickers or branded with old software logos, a patchwork of digital history in physical form. And of course, there was the Write Protect tab, a tiny sliding piece of plastic that turned your disk into read-only mode. Forget to flip it and you might lose your progress. Flip it too often and it might snap off entirely. Naturally, there were also tricks and hacks. Tech-savvy kids, or those with just enough curiosity and a power drill, figured out that punching an extra notch into the casing of a lower-capacity disk could sometimes fool disk drives into treating it like a high-density version. It wasn't officially sanctioned, and it wasn't without risk. But in an era when storage was expensive and precious, it felt like a secret superpower. This kind of hands-on, DIY experimentation was part of the floppy disk's charm. It invited tinkering and rewarded those who weren't afraid to pry into the guts of their technology. Even the process of using a floppy was a sensory experience. The way the disk clicked into place when you inserted it into the drive, the mechanical whirring sound as the disk spun up and the read-write head scanned the data, the cautious ejection process, waiting for the little light to stop blinking so you didn't corrupt the file system. It was all very tactile, very deliberate. You weren't just opening a file. You were engaging in a tiny ritual that reminded you data wasn't abstract. It lived on a real piece of plastic, and it could be lost with a wrong move. Throughout the 1990s, floppy disks were absolutely everywhere. They were a fundamental part of daily computing life. Whether you were a high school student writing an essay, a game developer distributing your latest DOS title, or a small business owner backing up critical spreadsheets at the end of the day, no matter your level of tech savvy, if you were near a computer, you were near a floppy disk. Software commonly shipped on stacks of these disks, sometimes entire towers of them. Major programs like Microsoft Office or Windows 95 came on 20 or 30 floppies. And if you were installing a game like Monkey Island or SimCity 2000, you quickly learned the rhythm of insert, wait, click, eject, repeat. Disk swapping wasn't just a chore, it was a rite of passage. You had to pay attention, stay organized, and resist the urge to scream when Disk 12 suddenly failed after an hour of smooth progress. Your filing system had to be tight. Losing track of just one disk in the stack meant starting over, or at best, spending hours hunting under desks and in drawers. Meanwhile, in office environments, floppy disks were as essential as coffee and copy machines. WordPerfect documents, Lotus 1, 2, 3 spreadsheets, employee records, invoice templates, everything lived on floppies. People carried them in briefcases, kept them in labeled plastic cases, and lined them up like tiny vinyl records in desk drawers. Some users went the extra step and color-coded them by function or department. Many people remember having a favorite disk, even if they didn't admit it. Maybe it was the blue one with the faded sports team logo that somehow never corrupted, or the bright yellow one labeled Keep Out in marker, which of course contained a mix of embarrassing teenage journal entries, crude pixel drawings made in Microsoft Paint, and bootlegged MIDI files from their favorite bands. The personal connection to these disks made them more than just tools. They were digital diaries, time capsules of creativity, and sometimes even vessels of secrecy. But the floppy disk's reach extended beyond just practicality. It became a cultural symbol. That square shape, the sliding metal shutter, the satisfying tactile click when inserted into a drive, all of it was burned into the collective memory of a generation. Its image became so familiar and so closely associated with saving files that it eventually transcended its physical form. Even today, the save icon in most software is still a picture of a floppy disk, despite the fact that most people under 25 have never touched one, let alone used one. Back in the 90s, though, the floppy wasn't just an icon on a toolbar, it was your lifeline. If your computer froze or blue screened, and it often did, the floppy was the one thing standing between you and a lost school paper, a vanished project, or that all-important resume. Many first-time coders learn to save their Visual Basic creations to a floppy named something like Time Waster 2000 or Game Test 1, a tiny, literal disk full of hope. Throughout the decade, there were several attempts to evolve or even replace the floppy. High-capacity alternatives like the zip disk burst onto the scene with a promise of dramatically increased storage, 100 megabytes instead of 1.44. At the time, this felt like jumping from a pogo stick to a Saturn V rocket. But zip disks required special drives that weren't built into most computers. They cost more, and worst of all, they were prone to the dreaded click of death, a hardware failure that could take both your data and your drive with it. Other contenders emerged as well. Formats like the LS120 SuperDisk, Sony's Hi-FD, and the oddly named Floptical. Each one promised to solve the floppy's limitations, offering better capacity and speed. Some could even read the old disks while offering more space for new ones. But these formats came with a fatal flaw. They weren't universal. They didn't come standard with new PCs. They required their own hardware, and they were released into a world where CD-ROMs were already gaining ground and internet-based file transfers were just beginning to show promise. As the 1990s drew to a close, the humble floppy disk, once the cornerstone of digital storage for millions, began to show signs of irrelevance. It had served faithfully for over a decade, but the pressure was mounting from all directions. CD-ROMs, once a luxury reserved for only the most cutting-edge software and expensive machines, had become significantly more affordable and could hold far more data, hundreds of megabytes compared to the floppy's meager 1.44 megabytes. That kind of capacity opened up possibilities that floppy disks simply couldn't match. Entire multimedia encyclopedias, full-length audio albums, and sophisticated software suites could all fit on a single, shiny disk. Meanwhile, looming just beyond the horizon was another technology set to crush the floppy once and for all, the USB flash drive. Small, durable, and boasting increasingly massive storage capacities, these new devices didn't just outperform floppies, they obliterated them in terms of speed, convenience, and reliability. And then there was the internet. Dial-up connections were slow, sure, but they were getting faster every year. By the late 90s, email attachments and basic file transfers were becoming more common, and people were starting to share documents and images online instead of relying solely on physical media. Despite all of this, floppies still clung to life. In schools, in mom-and-pop shops, and in homes across the country, they remained the go-to method for moving files from one machine to another. Not everyone had a CD burner, and most people hadn't even heard of USB drives yet, let alone owned one. For many students growing up in the late 90s, the floppy disk was as essential as a backpack or a binder. It lived in pencil cases, coat pockets, and zippered compartments, usually stuffed into a sleeve of loose-leaf paper or nestled next to a graphing calculator. You might only have had one or two disks, so you protected them like treasure. Computer labs, whether in middle schools, high schools, or public libraries, were often littered with communal disks, some labeled, others mysteriously blank. If you forgot your own, you prayed there was a leftover one in the drawer. Sometimes you'd find one with a fading AOL logo or a misprinted promotional graphic, hinting at a past life filled with internet promises and dial-up dreams. You'd pop it in, erase whatever was there, unless it was write protected, and save your WordPerfect essay or PowerPoint presentation like your grade depended on it, because often it did. Ask anyone who lived through that time, and odds are they've got a floppy disk memory or two tucked away. Maybe it was formatting an entire stack of blank disks before a class project, watching the progress bar inch forward with mind-numbing slowness, or the panic of an install that froze on disk 6 out of 12, requiring you to eject and reinsert the same floppy multiple times, hoping for a miracle. Maybe it was the horror of discovering that your disk, your only disk, had somehow become corrupted, its contents unreadable, its label mocking you with the words "final paper" scrawled in Sharpie. Or maybe it was something simpler, the tactile joy of flipping the metal shutter back and forth absent-mindedly during class, even though you knew, deep down, you were probably damaging the disk every time. The truth is, they were never perfect. Floppies were vulnerable to magnets, dust, scratches, and heat. They were slow, with read-write speeds that felt glacial. Even by 1990 standards, you could fill one up with just a couple of high-resolution images. And yet, for all their limitations, they were a miracle at the time. Affordable, portable, and reliable enough for everyday use. They represented access and control in an era when computing still felt like magic. By the early 2000s, however, the writing was on the wall. Apple made a bold and controversial move by eliminating the floppy drive from its sleek, colorful iMac G3 in 1998, signaling the beginning of the end. Dell, IBM, and others followed suit not long after. USB flash drives stormed the market with silent efficiency, promising not just higher capacity, but faster performance, better durability, and plug-and-play ease. The shift was swift and almost no one looked back. Floppies became relics overnight, once critical, now quaint. Some disks ended up in junk drawers or cardboard boxes of old tech, their labels smudged and their surfaces dusty. Others found new life as coasters, craft projects, or novelty items at retro shops and flea markets. A few, preserved with care, became museum pieces, reminders of the early days of personal computing when every megabyte mattered and every file was a little more precious. Still, even as the technology disappeared, its image lingered. The floppy disk icon, once a literal representation of the thing you used to save your work, became a symbol embedded in digital culture. Even today, it lives on in software interfaces, used by people who've never touched a real one. But back in the 1990s, floppies weren't symbolic. They were real, functional, and vital. They were where kids saved their first lines of code, where early entrepreneurs stored business plans and client databases, and where countless pirated games, cracked software, and shareware demos passed hand to hand. They were a part of daily life in a digital world that was just starting to find its shape. For all their quirks and limitations, floppy disks helped bridge the analog past with the digital future, one loud plastic click at a time.
Come along, let's sing, where the joy will bring. Tune into the beat, feel the magic, it's true. Channel 199.x, we're here just for you.